Welcome, my children, to our annual delve into the macabre, where we look at a piece of horror cinema from long before we were even born.
This Halloween, we're opening up the tomb of The Mummy. Wait, no, The Mummy's Tomb is like an actual movie. This is just The Mummy.
The Mummy is a 1932 horror film produced by Universal Pictures with Boris Karloff as the titular mummy. It was directed by Karl Freund, who previously did cinematography on Fritz Lang's Metropolis and afterwards would work on I Love Lucy, where he would design the flat lighting system used in sitcoms to this day. Wait, what?
The Mummy was not originally intended to have a mummy in it, or to have anything to do with ancient Egypt at all. It was instead inspired by the life of Alessandro Cagliostro, a man with a wild ride of a Wikipedia page. But after John L. Balderston was hired to write the script, it was changed to the ancient Egyptian theme because people were still enamoured with Egypt after the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. Something Balderston was actually present for since he happened to be a journalist at the time.
With that being said, let's embrace the curse of the mummy.
The Mummy's Curse is also the name of a movie, by the way.
The Mummy opens with this very fun model shot as Swan Lake plays at us just like it famously does in the 1931 Dracula. We're shown the Scroll of Thoth, a scroll containing the magic words used by Isis to raise Osiris from the dead. It'll be important later, don't worry. The year is 1921 and we see a field expedition from the British Museum. Doing archaeology in Egypt. Two men are discussing their recent finds, with this guy, whose name is Ralph, claiming a box and mummy they found are the only things likely to bring them glory, only to be chastised by this fellow, whose name is Sir Joseph Wemple.
Much more is learned from studying bits of broken pottery than from all the sensational finds. Our job is to increase the sum of human knowledge of the past, not to satisfy our own curiosity.
A third person, who's called Dr. Muller, has been inspecting the discovered mummy and chimes in to tell them that this mummy hasn't had their internal organs removed like they normally would be, and that they'd struggled in their bandages, all suggesting they were buried alive rather than going through the usual mummification process. They read an inscription on the inside of his casket that reads, Imhotep, High Priest of the Temple of the Sun at Karnak. Imhotep was a real person, by the way, although in reality he wasn't a high priest, he was a chancellor, and possibly an architect who was later deified into the god of medicine and healing. They speculate that he must have done something really bad to warrant this fate, since the sacred spells that would normally protect his soul on the way to the afterlife have been chipped away. Whoever did this wanted him dead both in this life and the next.
Ralph wonders if they'd get answers in the box they found along with the mummy, so they decide to open it up. Inside is another smaller gold box marked with the seal of the pharaoh. They open that to reveal a third even smaller box with the following inscription on it.
Death, eternal punishment, for anyone who opens this casket.
Muller, who is an expert in the occult, says they shouldn't open it because, curse. The others are unconvinced but agree not to open it for the time being. Muller and Joseph go outside, discussing how they both think the box contains the legendary Scroll of Thoth, with Joseph being all like, I gotta open it, it's the Scroll of Thoth, and Muller retorting, dude, don't open it, it's the Scroll of Thoth. Meanwhile, Ralph just can't help himself and decides to open the dang thing anyway, finding a scroll inside. As he begins to translate it, the mummy opens his eyes and begins to move. It reaches out, picking up the scroll, alerting Ralph to its presence. He does not take it well.
What's the matter, man? For heaven's sakes, what is it?
He went for a little walk.
For a bit of historical context, this is actually a really early example of a shambling monster mummy. Before the 30s, the most common type would be best described as hot lady mummies looking for sex in your area. God, I wish I could have thought of a MILF joke to put here.
11 years later, we see a similar expedition. As a British person, I should probably care that this Union flag is being flown upside down, but honestly, I have to always check to see what the right way up is anyway. Turns out that Sir Joseph's son, Frank, is also in the stealing historical artefacts for the British Museum game, but is having even less luck than his father.
Well, in the days when he used to come out here, there wasn't so much competition.
When he did, he found things. And once, 10 years ago, he found too much.
10 years ago? But whatever. We learned that Sir Joseph never came back to Egypt after his experience we saw a moment ago, and poor Ralph died still laughing. There's a knock at the door, and a mysterious Boris Karloff-shaped stranger enters. He knows their expedition hasn't been going well, so he offers to show them the most sensational find since Tutankhamun.
He shows them a fragment of the funerary equipment of the Princess Ankh-Senamun as proof, and says he'll show them where to dig to find her tomb. Her name seems to be borrowed from the historical figure
Ankh-Senamun,
who was Tutankhamun's wife, for those who accidentally clicked on this video looking for ancient Egypt trivia.
I'm sure it's very good of you, Mr. I didn't catch your name.
Ardath Bey.
Oh, here's another fun name thing. Ardath Bey is an anagram of death by Ra, Ra being the ancient Egyptian sun god. Ardath Bey is also the name of a very different character in the 1999 movie The Mummy. They go out to dig, and by that we mean that they get other people to dig while they chill under an umbrella, and lo and behold, they find the tomb, still sealed after 3,700 years.
We cut to the Cairo Museum sometime later, where the artifacts from the tomb are being displayed. Ardath Bey is there, looking longingly at the princess's mummy. We transition to a lady called Helen Grosvenor, who is a patient of Dr. Muller. She's at a party and is looking longingly out at the pyramids. In a bit of exposition, these two chaps mention that her father is the English governor of Sudan and her mother is an Egyptian from a very old family. Back at the museum, Sir Joseph, who has come back to Egypt to study the find, tells Ardath that it's closing time, he doesn't have to go home, but he can't stay here. But upon discovering he's the person that led them to the dig site, he invites him to stay. We also discover Ardath doesn't like to be touched, which is fair. Retiring to Sir Joseph's office, they run into Frank, who hasn't seen the mysterious man since the digging began, but Ardath makes his excuses and leaves.
But now I must not detain you.
But I must see you again. You must come to my house.
Bit desperate there, Joe. Frank also says something about how he thinks it's a dirty trick that Cairo is keeping the artifacts, and the British Museum has enough stolen stuff in it, so, maybe let them keep some of their own artifacts, yeah?
Back in the exhibition, Ardath has the Scroll of Thoth and is secretly murmuring some kind of incantation, repeating Ankh-Senamun's name, which seems to have an effect on Helen, making her leave the party in a trance-like state. She arrives at the museum by taxi as Frank and Joseph are leaving. She tries to gain entry before collapsing, so they decide the best thing to do is to take her back to their place. Once there, she starts muttering in ancient Egyptian and saying the name Imhotep. At the museum, a security guard finally notices what Ardath is up to and tries to stop him, but is killed off camera. Helen, now awake, is rather confused as to where she is and has no memory of what she did. Muller shows up to find her before going off to talk with Joseph. Frank, for some reason, decides to share this nugget about opening the tomb of the princess and finding her mummy.
When we got the wrappings off, and I saw her face, you'll think me silly, but I sort of fell in love with her.
That was a corpse, Frank. That's not silly. That's mildly terrifying. But it's okay, you see, because he insinuates that Helen looks a little like the corpse he has a crush on, which is normal.
Do you have to open graves to find girls to fall in love with?
Meanwhile, Joseph is telling Muller what Helen has been saying, especially the stuff about Imhotep, since the last time they encountered that name it didn't go well for poor Ralph. They're interrupted by a phone call from the museum telling them that a guard has been found dead. Heading over to the museum, they find the guard has died of shock and was clutching the scroll. They initially assume it was a bungled theft, but they realise that the scroll isn't one from the exhibition. Back at the Wempel place, Frank and Helen continue to flirt, and the older gentlemen walk in to see them kissing. They take Frank aside and discuss the connection between the scroll, Imhotep, and Helen. Joseph had originally believed Imhotep's mummy was just stolen rather than walked out, but now he's not so sure. They think about maybe just burning the scroll and being done with it.
At that point, Ardath comes to the door and is able to enthrall the doorman with, mummy magic or something? He enters the main room where Helen is sleeping, and she wakes to find him looming ominously over her. He was good at looming, was Boris. Big loomer. Very good. He apologises and introduces himself, saying that he came to speak to Sir Joseph and asks if he can wait here for him. He also states that she is very familiar. Frank notices Ardath is in there with Helen, by now realising there is some connection between him and the rest of the strange nonsense happening, so they go out to see what's going on. They question him about how he knew where to find the tomb, and he basically shrugs it off and says it was an educated guess. Then Helen and Ardath have a bit of a moment where she inadvertently reveals she was the person drawn to the museum.
Frank then takes Helen back to her hotel, whilst Muller grills Ardath with receipts. And by receipts we mean a transcription of the scroll and a picture of the mummified Imhotep, postulating that the mummy was not stolen but may have come alive, with the insinuation being that Ardath is the mummy, because, He's played by Boris Karloff. He's the mummy. Ardath, or I guess we should say Imhotep, just kind of gives up the facade and is like, look, just give me the scroll or I'll kill you. You can't hurt me. I'm the mummy. And they're like, we don't even have the scroll. It's not in the room behind us. Don't look. Wait, I've just realised that a huge chunk of the plot of this movie only happens because Imhotep forgets to pick up his scroll at the museum. Huh.
Ardath tells him to get it and to give it to the Nubian servant. That's the guy he controlled earlier. Yeah, the Nubian, who's played by Noble Johnson, doesn't really have a name. They just call him the Nubian, which is a little like if we just called Sir Joseph the Englander. We discover the reason Imhotep can control him is since Nubians have ancient blood, and I know what they were going for here. Nubians are a people that have lived in that area since people have lived anywhere, really, so there's a connection to the civilization Imhotep comes from, but, you know, when an old white guy starts talking about ancient blood in a movie of this age, you can't help but get a little bit nervous.
If I could get my hands on you, I'd break your dried flesh to pieces. But your power is too strong.
Yeah, I'd beat you up, but I just don't, I just don't feel like it right now.
That night, there's a cat. That night, Imhotep turns on his tiny pool/TV set and watches as Joseph pulls out the scroll from its hidey hole and places it on the fire to burn it. But using his mummy powers, Imhotep makes Sir Joseph come down with a lethal case of tit pain, killing him before he can do the deed. The Nubian then enters and takes the scroll whilst burning a newspaper in the fire as a substitute. The next morning, Muller and Frank are pondering over Joseph's death, believing the scroll to have been destroyed. Muller tries to give Frank an Isis amulet for protection, but Frank doesn't believe in any of this talk of mummies and thinks that his father's death was just a regular heart attack caused by all this talk of the supernatural. Muller then tells him, now look, this is important, Helen thinks you're hot. And Frank's reply is more or less, well, I know my dad just died and so it's a bad time, but do you think I'm in with a shot? Muller gathers up some of the ashes from the fire whilst Frank calls up Helen to tell her not to leave the hotel as they'll both be over soon.
In the car ride, Muller figures out that the ashes were of a newspaper, so not only does Imhotep have the scroll, but the Nubian, who has gone missing, is definitely on Team Mummy now. Muller once again offers the amulet to Frank, who takes it because, as Muller says, if the mummy is going after Helen, as he seems to be, then her love for Frank could mean that he'll try to kill Frank just like he did Joseph, so he needs all the protection he can get. Anyway, mummy powers activate. I'm gonna tell you, that is not a noise you want to listen to while wearing hearing aids. So Helen has, seemingly by mummy mind powers, been lured to Imhotep's lair with her big, adorable dog. His name is Wolfram, and I love him.
You will not remember what I show you now, and yet I shall awaken memories of love and crime and death.
God, I can't imagine how awkward this shot was to do in 1932.
On the pool TV, we're shown Imhotep's backstory. He was in love with Anxanamen, a princess who looks astonishingly like Helen, but she died. After she was mummified and laid to rest, Imhotep stole the Scroll of Thoth, believing he could bring her back to life using its spells, and angering the gods in the process. He was discovered attempting to do this unholy thing in her tomb and was condemned to death by his father, the Pharaoh. Oh, and by the way, the actor playing the Pharaoh was like 2 years younger than Karloff, and yeah, it shows. Wait, if Imhotep is the Pharaoh's son, and Imhotep is in love with the princess... Oh, royalty is weird. So yeah, Imhotep was sentenced to the nameless death, wrapped up and buried alive along with the scroll to avoid it being used for such a thing again. Identifying marks were removed from his sarcophagus, except this one from the start of the movie apparently, seeing as shoddy workmanship is timeless, and it was buried without ceremony. The enslaved people who buried him were also killed, as were the soldiers that killed them, so that none would know where he was buried. Helen, it turns out, is a reincarnation of sorts of Anxanamen, which is why she has the connection to Imhotep. He wants to fully manifest her spirit into Helen's body, but must first kill Frank since her love for him would just be like a real bummer for his plan. There was actually supposed to be a whole montage seeing her various past lives throughout the years, which was filmed but cut for time. It's why there's a credit for the Saxon despite him not actually being in the movie.
Anyway, Helen was hypnotised this whole time, and he wakes her up just in time to hear her dog getting killed. I'm just gonna say, Wolfram deserved better.
I will remember you.
Helen returns to her hotel to find Frank waiting for her. She's defensive at first, but then asks for help, since she knows she can't help but go back to Imhotep, and if she does, it'll mean death for her and life for something else inside her.
We'll take you to my house. Oh, Helen, it's been such torture. I love you so.
That's a bit needy there, mate. A few days pass with Helen at the Wemple residence. She's been getting weaker and weaker, much to the bafflement of medical science. She keeps asking to leave. It goes a little like this. Can I go play with the mummy? No. Alright then. However, Muller realises that her deteriorating condition is down to Imhotep, who they have been unable to find. He believes Helen will likely regain her strength should she actually go to him, so Muller tells her to just do so when she next feels the pull. The plan being they'll follow her and destroy the mummy wherever he may be. Although they don't actually say how they're going to destroy him, so I don't really know how good of a plan this is. That night, Frank hangs his amulet on Helen's door, which is a nice gesture, but all it really means is that Imhotep can now try and kill him, which he does. Fortunately for Frank, he reaches the amulet just in time to save his life, rendering him unconscious. However, this allows Helen to leave without anyone following.
At the museum, Helen wakes up as Ankh-Sanamen, remembering her previous life and seemingly fully taking on the persona. But this isn't enough for Imhotep, who wants to make her immortal like him. Ankh-Sanamen looks at her original mummified body, which I can imagine would be probably quite a strange thing to process. Imhotep smashes the display cabinet. Just ignore the fact that you can clearly see that there's no glass in there and it's only a sound effect. Pulling the mummy out, declaring that it must be destroyed for reasons, something to do with the immortality thing, I don't know, and then sets it on fire. This might be the most sedate corpse burning scene I've ever watched. I mean, top 5 at least. Entering into another chamber, the Nubian is busy making, I don't know, stew or something. Imhotep reveals he must kill her in order to bring her back to life. Ankh-Sanamen rejects this because she wants to live and starts to remember that she is also Helen.
For thy sake I was buried alive. I ask of thee only a moment of agony.
It's not a competition.
Helen tries to escape, but the Nubian is ordered to catch her. Imhotep then uses his mummy powers to get her to agree to the whole kill you to make you immortal thing. At the house, Muller finds an unconscious Frank and they make haste to the museum, Muller realising exactly what Imhotep is up to, mostly because there's only a few minutes left of the movie, so everyone really needs to get on the same page. Imhotep prepares to stab the now willing Ankh-Sanamen, but Frank calling out Helen's name seems to snap her out of it a little and she prays to a statue of Isis, asking Isis to save her. Frank and Muller enter the room, but Imhotep uses his mummy powers one last time. Hey, stop that. This is almost uncomfortable. But then the statue of Isis moves its arm, Ankh glowing. The scroll of Thoth catches fire and Imhotep goes from being a revitalised living corpse to being a desiccated dead corpse. As we hear his bones clatter to the ground, the gents head over to Helen. That is a really weird edit to end on.
So, that was The Mummy. Now what do we think of it? Of the 3 Universal films we've covered, we'd say that this was our least favourite. That's not to say it doesn't have the comfy feeling we've previously mentioned the Universal monster movies having, but it's just a little slow and lacks a lot of the spectacle that Frankenstein or the Wolfman had. It's also often commented that a lot of the movie seems to borrow elements from the 1931 Dracula, again making it feel a little less unique. However, this was the first of the big Universal monsters that wasn't based on existing works, so I suppose they just leaned on a formula they knew that worked. Karloff's performance is understated, but he does have a looming menace that makes for an effective antagonist. The fully mummified Imhotep looks fantastic, even if it's barely in the film. The scene of him coming to life remains creepy to this day. And although less elaborate looking, the standard makeup Karloff is wearing was incredibly impressive too, when you consider the materials available at the time. Zita Johann puts in a good performance as Helen also, especially when you consider that she and director Karl Freund really did not get on. Also, the guy who painted the poster seemed to have a vendetta against her. I mean, I don't really know how else to explain this.
Of course, the movie does have that general let's be polite and say awkwardness inherent with watching an American movie from the 1930s that borrows heavily from other cultures it doesn't really seem to respect all that much, amplified when the heroes are people engaging in activities that have repercussions to this day. But on the upside, it does have a cat and a dog, and they are very cute. The Mummy didn't have any direct sequels, but what it does have is a bunch of reimaginings. In 1940, many elements and some footage were recycled for The Mummy's Hand, which is about a different mummy named Caris. That had 3 sequels, as well as the obligatory Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, and it was also the basis for the 1959 Hammer version of The Mummy. In 1999 we got the fun Mummy film that most of you are probably aware of, which takes a lot of elements from the original but makes it into a big action-adventure spectacle. Also, everyone is really attractive in this version for some reason. It had 2 sequels, the first of which spawned the Scorpion King series of movies. They've made 5 of them apparently. 5 Scorpion King movies. The last one came out in 2018. They've made 5 Scorpion King movies. This era of mummy films also had an animated series that ran for 2 seasons. It's nothing special, but since they mix up the British Museum and the Natural History Museum in episode 1, we do get to see an animated appearance of Dippy the Diplodocus. Although even if this was supposed to be the Natural History Museum, it would still be an error since Dippy, although being in the museum in the 1930s when this cartoon is set, wasn't actually placed in the main hall until 1979. Now, you might call this unnecessary pedantry, but I call it having the appropriate amount of respect for a fallen comrade.
Finally, in 2017 there was The Mummy starring Tom Cruise, but that has since been lost to time. It's not lost media or anything, just nobody really cares enough to go and watch it again. So while the 1932 Mummy may not be quite up there with some of the other classic Universal movies, there was enough meat left on that desiccated corpse to inspire many, many other movies. Some of which are pretty great, and some are Scorpion King sequels, and far too many of them are just called The Mummy, making finding information about each movie more annoying than it probably should be. But now the time of spooks and scares has ended for this year, and so we bid you farewell.
Gonna be honest, I'm a little disappointed that we never managed to sneak in a reference to mummies alive anywhere in this video.
We'll try harder next time.
I like the way you smile at me, babe.